It was one of those early autumn evenings when the sun hangs low in the sky, casting everything in a soft, golden haze. The air smelled of dry leaves and distant chimneys, and I had just finished watering the potted mums on my front porch when I saw him across the street. I had seen Ethan before, of course. He was my neighbor Carol's son. But until that night, I had never really noticed him. He'd always seemed like a shadow in the background of my quiet life. Home for visits, helping his mother with yard work. Polite with a casual wave and then gone again. He was probably in his early 30s, maybe a little older now. Time had a funny way of speeding past when you weren't paying attention. That evening, Carol had called me in a bit of a panic. She was driving out of town for a last-minute work thing and asked if I could keep an eye on her house for a couple of days, check the mail, maybe water the plants on her deck. I said yes without thinking. I'd done it before. We weren't best friends, but we were neighborly enough, and I liked feeling useful. I wasn't expecting to see anyone over there that night. But just as I stepped off my porch to cross the street, I saw movement behind the curtains. Tall figure passed by the window, and for a second, I froze. Carol hadn't mentioned anyone staying there. When I knocked on the door, it was Ethan who opened it. "Oh," he said, blinking as if I'd startled him. "I, Ms. Carter." That's what he always called me. I hated it. Made me feel like someone's schoolteacher. I gave him a half smile. "Hi, Ethan. Your mom asked me to come check on things. I didn't know anyone else would be here." He scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, she told me last minute. I'm staying the weekend, watching the house while she's gone." "Sorry if I scared you." "You didn't scare me," I said, stepping back. "Just caught me off guard is all. I should have walked away right then." I had done my part, but something made me linger. Maybe it was the way the light inside spilled over his shoulder. Warm, inviting. Maybe it was how he looked at me. Not like I was some older neighbor lady, but with something else in his eyes. Something searching. "You want to come in for a bit?" he asked. I was just about to make some tea. "Or something stronger, if you prefer." I hesitated. For years, I'd made a habit of saying no to things like that. Little invitations. Moments that could go somewhere unexpected. But for some reason, I said yes. Inside, the house smelled like cedar wood and laundry detergent. He'd opened a window, letting in the crisp evening air. I sat on the edge of the couch while he disappeared into the kitchen. There was music playing softly, something mellow and acoustic, and I let it wash over me as I looked around. The house was familiar but different, lived in by someone younger for the weekend. He came back with 2 glasses of red wine. I figured, "This might be better than tea," he said, handing one to me. "Cheers." I clinked my glass against his. Cheers. The wine was rich and smooth, and we talked. At first it was simple stuff. How his job in Denver was going, how his was doing, what the neighborhood had been like lately. But before long, the conversation turned more personal. He asked about me. Really asked. It had been a long time since. Someone had looked at me like that when I spoke. Not just politely nodding, but listening, seeing. I told him about my garden, about how I used to be a nurse, about how quiet the house felt some days now that my kids were gone, and my husband had been out of the picture for years. "You don't seem lonely," he said after a pause. I looked at him. "Surprised, don't I?" "No, you seem calm, like you've made peace with things." I smiled, but it felt a little sad. "Peace and loneliness can live in the same house, Ethan." He nodded slowly and then looked at me in a way that made my chest tighten, like he understood something unspoken. like he wasn't afraid of it. The silence between us grew heavy, not uncomfortable, just charged. I looked down at my half-empty glass. "I should probably go," I said, not moving. He leaned back, his voice low. "You can, or you could stay a bit longer. Talk with me some more." I should have said no. I was 60 years old. I had a routine, a rhythm. I had no business being in my neighbor's house, sipping wine with her son, letting the air between us thicken like that. But I stayed. We talked until the moon was high and the street outside had gone still. He leaned forward at one point, elbows on his knees, and asked me the kind of question people don't usually ask each other. "Do you ever feel like life passed you by while you were busy being responsible?" My breath caught in my throat. I did, more than I liked to admit. I nodded slowly. "That's how I feel lately," he said, staring into his glass. Like I blinked and all, the things I thought I'd do. I didn't. The room was warm and the space between us felt smaller than it had been hours before. I saw something raw in him, something I wasn't prepared for, but didn't want to look away from. He looked up at me and I saw the question in his eyes before he even said it. "Do you think it's ever too late to start again?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew that whatever this moment was, it was real and rare, and I didn't want it to end. I set down my glass, and I stayed. The next morning I woke up in my own bed with the softest light slipping through the curtains. For a moment I wasn't sure if it had all really happened. The late-night conversation, the way Ethan had looked at me, how I had let myself drift into something that felt too unexpected to name. But it had happened. Of that I was certain. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I moved through the motions of the morning, coffee, shower, folding laundry, but my thoughts kept circling back to the night before. Not because anything inappropriate had happened. We hadn't even touched, not really. It was just the way he made me feel, seen, heard, noticed in a way I hadn't felt in years. By midday, I had convinced myself it was all just a fleeting moment. Maybe the wine had made it all feel more significant than it really was. Maybe he'd already forgotten all about it. But around 3 o'clock, as I was trimming the hydrangeas along the side of my porch, I heard his voice again. "Hey, Linda." I turned, and there he was, hands in his pockets, that same soft expression on his face. I must have looked surprised because he gave me a half smile. "I brought your coffee mug," he said, holding it up. "You left it last night." I walked to the edge of the yard and took it from him. Our fingers brushed for half a second, and I felt it again. That quiet spark that didn't belong in a casual, niggardly moment. "Thanks," I said, my voice a little more breathy than I meant it to be. I wasn't sure if I actually left it or just imagined the whole thing. He chuckled. "No, it happened. I didn't dream it either. I could have ended the conversation there. I could have turned back to my flowers and let the afternoon go on like any other. But instead, I asked, 'You hungry?' His brow lifted slightly and his smile deepened. 'Are you inviting me to lunch, Miss Carter?' "I told you not to call me that," I said, turning toward the house. "Come on, I made too much chicken salad anyway." He followed me inside, and just like that, the rhythm of my quiet little world shifted again. We sat at the small table near my kitchen window, sunlight warming the wood surface between us. He looked so at ease in my home, like it wasn't strange at all for him to be there. And for a while, it wasn't. We talked about music, old movies, silly things that didn't carry weight. But then something shifted. He asked me why I never remarried. A bold question. But there was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity. I looked down at my fork for a long moment before answering. Because I got used to being by myself, I said. I figured it was better to be alone and at peace than with someone who didn't really see me. He nodded slowly. That makes sense. Then he leaned back, his gaze steady. But I saw you last night, Linda. I really did, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since. I felt my stomach flutter, and I hated how surprised I was by it. I was 60 years old, for God's sake. These feelings belonged to younger women, women who still wore perfume every day, who bought new dresses for dates, who didn't check the mirror, for lines near their mouth before they smiled. But in that moment, I didn't feel old. I just felt alive. Still, I had to say something. Ethan, I'm not sure what this is. I mean, I'm twice divorced and twice your age. Almost. Not quite, he said, with a teasing grin. And you don't feel twice my age. His words made my heart thud in a way I hadn't felt in decades. But I stayed quiet. My instincts told me to retreat, to protect myself. But something else, something deeper, told me to just feel it for once. After lunch, we lingered in the living room. I don't even remember what we started watching. A documentary, maybe. Something about small towns in America. But we didn't really pay attention. There were pauses in our conversation now. Not because we didn't have things to say, but because the air between us was thick again. With wonder, with tension, with questions neither of us quite knew how to ask. He turned to me at one point and said, "You have the kind of presence that makes people slow down. It's grounding." I laughed, maybe a little too nervously. That's a nice way of saying I'm quiet. No, he said, inching closer. It's a way of saying, you make people feel safe. I haven't felt that in a long time. The quiet that followed was not empty. It pulsed between us like a second heartbeat. He didn't kiss me, not yet. But he looked at me like he wanted to, and I realized I wanted it too. Not for the thrill, not for some fleeting pleasure, but because it felt real, unexpected, kind, and something about that made it even more powerful. I walked him to the door, before the sky turned orange again. "Thanks for lunch," he said. "Any time." He lingered on the porch. "Are you going to be okay tonight?" he asked. "I mean, if you need anything." "I'll be okay," I said softly. "But thank you." And then he did something small, but significant. He reached out and gently touched my hand, just for a moment. His thumb brushed the top of mine. Not a flirtation, not a move, just connection. "I'll see you tomorrow," he asked. I nodded. Yes. When the door closed behind him, I leaned against it and pressed my hand to my chest. My heart was racing, and not in a way that frightened me. Something had been set in motion, something neither of us had planned for. And though I didn't know where it would lead, for the first time in a very long while I wanted to find out. The following day started with an ache I hadn't expected, not in my body, but somewhere quieter, deeper. I moved through my morning in a haze, brushing, my hair with slower strokes, watching the birds flit across the yard with more attention than they probably deserved. I couldn't stop replaying our conversations. The way Ethan had touched my hand the night before. How steady and sincere his eyes were when he asked if I'd be okay. It wasn't some silly crush. I wasn't a teenager daydreaming about the boy next door. No, this was something different. more grounded, more complicated. And still, when the knock came at a little past 10, I felt that same flutter rise in my chest. Ethan stood on my porch again, holding 2 to-go cups and a brown paper bag. "Thought I'd return the favor," he said, lifting the bag. "Breakfast?" I smiled despite myself and stepped aside. "You always bring food." "That's a dangerous habit. I figure it's the least I can do for the woman who fed me chicken salad and offered therapy in her living room." We laughed, and just like that, the weight between us lightened. He placed the cups on the table and unwrapped a couple of breakfast burritos from a local cafe. We sat by the window again, some light spilling in like it had the day before, but something was different this time. Less hesitation, less pretending. This was just neighborly kindness. "So," he said after a few quiet bites, "what's your plan today?" I shrugged. "I was thinking of going to the farmer's market, maybe picking up some fall squash. Wanna come?" He didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I'd like that." And so we went, just like that. 2 people, 20-something years apart, walking side by side past stalls of apples, honey jars, handmade soaps, and gourds the size of toddlers. He held my bag for me without asking. He asked questions about what I like to cook. And when I laughed at something a little too loudly near the cinnamon stand, he looked at me like the sound had caught him off guard in a good way. It felt natural, which in some ways made it all the more strange. On the drive back, he looked out the window and said quietly, "I think I like being around you because it makes me feel steadier." I glanced at him. "You don't seem like someone who struggles with steadiness." He gave a small, crooked smile. "You'd be surprised. Most of my life, I've been chasing things. Jobs, relationships, approval. Being with you, it feels like I don't have to chase anything." I didn't know what to say to that. Compliments like that at my age weren't just rare, they were almost unimaginable. I wasn't used to being someone's calm in the storm. We carried the groceries inside together, laughing about the ridiculous shape of a butternut squash. And then, almost without thinking, I reached out to adjust a leaf stuck to his shoulder. My fingers lingered just a second too long. He didn't move. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy with anticipation. I looked at him, really looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the gentle strength in his posture, the kindness that never seemed to leave his face. He wasn't a boy. He was a man who had lived, who had struggled, who had found his way to my doorstep in the most unexpected way. "Ethan," I said quietly, "what are we doing?" He stepped closer. "I don't know yet, but I don't want to pretend anymore." My breath caught. "I don't want to scare you," he said, "but I also don't want to waste this." I felt every word settle in my chest like small stones, gentle but undeniable. "I've spent so much of my life doing the right thing," I whispered, following the rules, living inside the lines. "And right now, I want to color outside them, for once." His hand reached for mine, gently, not urgently, and I let him take it. We stood there like that, our fingers intertwined, in the middle of my quiet kitchen, with sunlight pouring through the window and the scent of apples and cinnamon still in the air. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was slow, respectful, a connection unfolding with care. "I want to be careful with this," he said. "With you." I nodded. "Me too." He stayed for dinner. We cooked together, roasted vegetables, a simple soup, and a bottle of wine we never quite finished. The radio played soft jazz in the background, and there was a moment, just a small one, when I caught him looking at me while I stirred the pot, like I was something worth watching. When the evening crept in and the stars began to blink outside, we found ourselves on the back porch sharing a blanket, the world falling quiet around us. "Do you ever wonder what people would say?" I asked, my voice low. "Maybe," he said, "but I care more about what you feel, and what I feel when I'm with you." There it was again, that stillness, that sense that somehow, despite all logic, we had stumbled into something neither of us had expected, but neither of us wanted to walk away from. And in that moment, I stopped questioning it. For the first time in years, I stopped second-guessing what I deserved. I leaned my head on his shoulder, and we stayed like that, quiet, watching the stars, as something delicate and real began to bloom between us. The days that followed unfolded like pages in a book I hadn't realized I was still allowed to write. Each morning brought a new rhythm, gentler, fuller. Ethan didn't move in, and I didn't expect him to. But he came by more often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to sit with me in the quiet. We didn't need big declarations or elaborate plans. We were discovering something slow and deliberate, and I cherished every second of it. But of course, the world doesn't stop to give you space. When something delicate begins, people notice, and people talk. Carol returned from her trip 2 days later. I knew I'd have to speak to her eventually. It was a warm afternoon when I saw her out front pulling weeds, her wide sun hat shielding most of her face. I took a deep breath, slipped on my sandals, and walked over. "Hey, stranger," I called. She looked up and smiled. "Linda, you kept my plants alive. I hope you did." We made small talk, and I almost convinced myself not to bring up Ethan. But that wouldn't have been fair. Not to her. Not to me. "I've seen Ethan a few times since you left," I said, trying to keep my tone even. She wiped her brow and nodded. "Yeah. He mentioned he stopped by to drop something off. Said you two caught up." I hesitated. "It was more than that, Carol. We've spent time together. We've talked. A lot. And some things happened between us. Something I didn't expect." She looked at me, her expression unreadable at first. Then she smiled, softly, not mockingly, not shocked, just thoughtfully. "Linda," she said, "you've always been one of the kindest people I know. If Ethan finds peace with you, who am I to question it?" I exhaled, a wave of relief washing over me. We didn't talk about it much more after that, but her grace meant more to me than she knew. Later that evening, Ethan stopped by with a small bouquet of sunflowers. "Thought these felt like you," he said, handing them to me at the door. I smiled and took them, brushing my fingertips against his. "They do." We ended up in the living room again, this time with an old jazz record spinning in the background. It was getting late, and for once I didn't feel like sending him home. He sat beside me on the couch, close but respectful as always. The flicker of the lamp cast a golden hue across his face. "I think about you more than I should," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "And what should we do about that?" He reached for my hand again, our fingers slipping together like they'd always known how. "Maybe nothing," he said. "Maybe just this. You and me. No pressure. No rules." I felt my chest swell with something that wasn't quite love, not yet, but something close. Something honest. Something possible. I leaned into him, resting my head on his chest. His arm wrapped around me instinctively, warm and steady. We didn't speak for a long while, just listened to the music, to the beat of each other's breathing. And in that silence, I let go of the old doubts, the old expectations. I stopped worrying about appearances, about age, about time lost. Because here, in this quiet, unexpected space, I had found something I hadn't even known I was looking for. Connection. Not forced, not chased, just found. The kind that happens when you stop trying to be what the world expects and finally let yourself be seen. That night, Ethan stayed until the sky turned pale. We didn't rush into anything. We didn't need to. Every glance, every touch, every shared breath said more than words could. And when he finally stood to leave, he kissed my cheek softly. Tender, lingering, sincere. "I'll see you tomorrow," he asked. I nodded, smiling. Yes, tomorrow. As the door closed behind him, I stood still for a moment, hand resting on my heart. I had lived a full life already. Raised children, built a career, lost and loved and endured. But I never expected something new to begin at this stage. And yet it had. Not a fairy tale, not a whirlwind, but something better, real and beautifully mined.